A poem from Ella Wilcox, The Things That Count. Now, dear, it isn't the bold things, great deeds of valor and might, that count the most in summing up of life at the end of the day. But it is the doing of old things, small acts that are just and right, and doing them over and over again, no matter what others say, in smiling at fate when you want to cry, and in keeping at work when you want to play. Dear, those are the things that count. And dear, it isn't always the ways where the wonder-seekers crowd that lead us into the land of content or help us to find our own. But it is in keeping to true ways, though the music is not so loud. And there may be many a shadowed spot where we journey along alone, in flinging a prayer at the face of fear and in changing into a song a groan. Dear, these are the things that count. My dear, it isn't the loud part of creeds that are pleasing to God, not the chant of a prayer or the hum of a hymn or a jubilant shout or song, but it is the beautiful, proud part of walking with feet faith-shod and in loving, through all, no matter how things go wrong, in trusting ever, though dark the day, and in keeping your hope when the way seems long. Dear, these are the things that count. Our gospel reading today comes from Luke, the 4th chapter, verses 1 through 13. Jesus, full of the Holy Spirit, returned from the Jordan and was led by the Spirit into the wilderness, where for 40 days he was tested by the devil. He ate nothing at all during those days, and when they were over, he was famished. The devil said to him, "If you are the Son of God, command this stone to become a loaf of bread." And Jesus answered him, "It is written, one does not live by bread alone." Then the devil led him up and showed him in an instant all of the kingdoms of the world. And the devil said to him, "To you I will give all this authority and their glory, for it has been given over to me, and I give it to anyone I please. If you then will worship me, it will all be yours." And Jesus answered him, "It is written, worship the Lord your God and serve only him." Then the devil led him to Jerusalem and placed him on the pinnacle of the temple and said to him, "If you are the Son of God, throw yourself down from here, for it is written, he will command his angels concerning you to protect you, and on their hands they will bear you up, so that you will not dash your foot against a stone." And Jesus answered him, "It is said, do not put the Lord your God to the test." So when the devil had finished every test, he departed from him until an opportune time. Then Jesus, in the power of the Spirit, returned to Galilee, and a report about him spread throughout all of the surrounding region. The Gospel of the Lord.
Praise to you, O Christ.
You may be seated. I can tell that the South Toledo Parish indeed really wants to have a repentant Lenten season because you called me here to preach to you for this first Wednesday in Lent. And so I will do my best to make you sorry for calling me here. Anything I can do to help your piousness at this point. Interestingly enough, I in approaching this Lenten season, it's interesting because I've reflected a lot on bitterness. I've been focusing in the past year or two way too much on politics. As I'm sure all of us have been in the preceding number of years, where politics has been so vastly interesting to understanding human beings. And, I've given myself over to that on Facebook and my news platforms and studying the ways that things are done, whether it's master planning over the top of us in our neighborhoods or bike paths that we don't expect going up next to our businesses and our roads and this and that. And I've been wondering, in the big scheme of this, where a human being, when you feel so small, where do you fit into the larger scheme of things, And for my part, as I've reflected on these things, I've wrestled with an idea of bitterness, of how do you voice something, right, into the larger structures of our world that will allow us to feel like we are of some value, or are we just kind of consigned to experiences where we feel like we can't fix the potholes in our roads, and people do donuts in our parking lots with their cars, or we can't get drug dealers off the front steps of our church, which is something that I've wrestled with for years now, right? And you just wonder where you fit into it as a human being. And you know, there's something about that and the temptation towards bitterness that leads me towards a very small thinking. You know, I find myself looking at things in a very sort of small and narrow ways when I'm not at my best. And that makes me nervous. It makes me really nervous because I start to see myself looking things at a really trunicated version of what I can be. You know, at Salem, we've been trying to tackle some of those big issues that are really frustrating, right? One of the things that we've been doing is trying to get into what they call the social determinants of health, right? If you haven't heard this term, anybody who works in the nonprofit industrial complex can tell you that this is the new buzzword in order to talk about doing ministry out in the world. Not a bad thing, really, because, you know, you think about the shape of everything and how it affects our health and wellness as human beings. Sort of talks about an expanded scope of what does it mean to care for human beings? Well, the making of a park, the reducing of gun violence, and trying to impact things like infant mortality. All of them can get counted as the social determinants of health, so long as we work at them really intently, you know, as long as we come at them with some best practices. Those can all be counted as social determinants of health. And so in our own neighborhood, which is the Vistula neighborhood of Toledo, we have one of the areas that ranks highest in things like infant mortality, the need for lead abatement. There's a lot of lead poisoning in our area, especially among young people. And talking to the Toledo Health Department, at any given time, there are 5,000 young people, kids wrestling with lead poisoning in our community of Toledo, right? And my neighborhood in specific ends up being amongst the top 5 continually within that 5,000 young people wrestling with lead poisoning. And so you look at these big things and you wonder, well, what can we do? How can we even begin to wrestle with those things? And one of the ways that we've begun to wrestle with that, with infant mortality, is to begin to provide things like safe water pitchers in our neighborhood, water pitchers that get out lead, and they get out about 99% of dissolvable solids, you know, that are in our water. The things that make it taste gross, look gross. The water comes out about as pure as we as human beings can get it right now through a 5-stage filter, and it's an amazing thing. And then on top of that, you know, we've tried to add things like baby gates, and we're moving towards car seats, because outside of prenatal care, these are the things that can have the biggest impact, making sure that babies don't accidentally get poisoned, you know, trying to keep them away from unsafe areas and substances. And then car accidents, because there are apparently so many children that are riding around in cars without those car seats. And as I'm sure that you know, because your churches are, you know, have wide experience in this as well, whether it's, you know, food pantries or clothing closets or programs dealing with food, you know, it can become a real challenge to try to enact these things. So we have a young person, a teenager who we've worked with in the neighborhood, and she's now our administrative assistant, trying to build up her resumes and skills. You know, I find myself coaching her through scheduling of different services that the church needs regularly, and think about how that, you know, contributes to her own development as a human being. And she's been tasked with making sure that these families get these expensive water pitchers and these expensive baby gates. And so as we were touching base yesterday to talk about how that's going for her and leading that ministry, she says, "Pastor Mike, you won't believe what happened yesterday." And I said, "Oh, please do try me. Please do try me." And so she says, you know, I had a family, and I know that all of these people are in the same household, but they tried sending 4 different people claiming to be 4 different families to get 4 different baby gates instead of the one that we're sort of starting with allocating to each family. And she says, you know, I didn't know what to do. You know, I didn't know what to do, you know, but they ended up walking away with 4 baby gates because I didn't really realize or think about what was happening until it was over. And so it was an opportunity where sit down and talk to her about the issue. And I said, yeah, you know, it's really frustrating. You try to do something for people, and it kind of goes sideways from what you intend. You know, you can't enact fairness. You know, you can't sort of try to regulate things. You know, it becomes something where, you know, you kind of resent being tricked, right? You feel kind of little naked, a little ashamed when you find that you've been fleeced, right? And I think that in doing good, I think all of us can feel that way, not even just on the bigger levels that I listed before, but on these small levels where you're hoping to make a big impact. You can feel a little ashamed at maybe your own sense of powerlessness despite your big intentions and what you want to do in that realm. And so I sat down to her and I said, those things, they drive me a little nuts too, right? I want to make a big impact, but in the city of Toledo, I'm nobody. I'm not really anybody. I'm not one of your power players, and neither would I want to be, because I see what happens with those people. But at the same time, it doesn't stave off the thing of wanting to do something out of our faith that is much larger. And so in talking with her, I said, why are we passing out baby gates in the first place? Why are we even doing it? One answer is, of course, we want to be engaged with our society and other entities in meaningful ways, and this is one entree into that realm, right? Another thing is making a sign, right? A sign of this loving God that we have. That's how you know the sermon's really boring, is they start playing cricket noises in the middle of it. But then an entree into that. But then the other thing, the final thing really is, I said, why ultimately are we doing it? And I said, it's because we want infants to be safe. We want to spare lives. We want families to be safer. We want them to experience success and wellness in our life. And so I said to her, it's not something I'd like to advertise. I don't want everybody being like, that's a trick that really works. We're going to go over there to Salem and, everybody's going to pretend to be a different family member, and then we're going to get X number of gates. Lest it becomes some kind of business where they get resold in the community somehow, which is not the objective. But I said, if that family ultimately needed 4 gates so bad that they enacted this plan and got those 4 gates from us, then our hope is going to be that they use those 4 gates to have the safest possible household for their infants in their lives. And maybe it'll be the case then that that's one less infant that experiences an accident or a fatal incident in our community and in our city. And, we're going to chalk it up to that. Obviously we can't count that as 4 families served. We know better. But we can think about that one family in specific being a lot safer for it. And so that was sort of the tone that we set in the way that we went forward in there. And I think that's indicative of 2 ways of thinking that she and I were encountering in that moment, right? Because there is the temptation, and it's real, and it's understandable, to think very small, to think very, very small, which is to feel and let that bitterness and that resentment take over, right? Where we get so wrapped up in that we stop engaging in something that is a bigger calling than that, right? Where we sort of start to say, we're not respected by these people at all. This is a mess. We're just done with this. We give up. We can't make an impact. This is foolishness, and to just stop. On the other hand, I think there's the larger view, which is sort of, I think, the view that God's very self has, and even larger than we can imagine it, which is getting to the heart of discipleship, right? Which is that God loves this world and the people in it, that God has a bigger vision for their well-being and their goodness. In our gospel lesson today, we hear about Jesus being filled with the Holy Spirit, and it causes him to go out into the wilderness and to fast there, 40 days and 40 nights, We too might feel like we're in a sort of wilderness when we're in the midst of the vacant houses, the abandoned buildings, the food deserts. We have wildernesses in our own world. But Jesus goes out into a proper wilderness, which is a dangerous place in ancient times. You could very well die out there. The lack of sustenance, the lack of human connection, the lack of resources out into the wilderness. And as Jesus is out there, the devil thinks that this is an opportune time, right? Jesus is in a spot of suffering. And so now the devil wants to appear to him and begin to help him think very small, right? So the devil says to him, you know what? If you're really the Son of God, right? If you're really going to make a difference in this world, I want you to turn this stone into a loaf of bread. Now, why the devil wants Jesus to do this, not entirely sure. Not sure what that has to do with anything, turning a stone into a loaf of bread. And I'm sure that Jesus probably didn't either, because Jesus responds, one does not live by bread alone, and leaves it at that. So the devil decides he's going to try something a little bit better than that. The stone bread thing, kind of goofy. Decides he's going to try something just with a little more substance. So he takes Jesus up and he shows him at once all the kingdoms of the world, places that are far better than those available to Jesus in ancient Palestine, everything. And he says to him, I'll tell you what, I'll give you authority and glory, right? I'll let you be in charge of all these kingdoms if you just fall down and worship me. Now he's promising Jesus something big in order for doing something wrong. He says to him, this can all be yours. And Jesus answers, it is written, worship the Lord your God and serve only him. Jesus isn't going to fall into idolatry over this, right? Jesus isn't going to take this big thing, which is the wrong thing, right? Sacrificing the truly larger picture. And then the devil takes him to Jerusalem and puts him on the pinnacle of the temple. And he says, if you are the Son of God, throw yourself down from here. For it is written, he will command his angels concerning you to protect you. Another sort of idol thing, tempting Jesus just to display his power, to show how great and magnificent he himself is, right? To make a spectacle of himself, to make a true spectacle. And Jesus says, it is written, do not put the Lord your God to the test. Well, the devil being rebuffed so many times, trying all these different tactics and maneuvers in order to make this happen, decides that he's going to leave until a more opportune time. Think about that, a more opportune time. Devil's going to bide his time and wait for Judas Iscariot to come along instead at this point. But why? Why does Jesus refuse all of this? Yeah, we know he's the Son of God. He's not going to do anything sinful. But still, what is wrong with all of these things? The idolatry, yeah, we sort of get that. But the other displays of power, why? It's because Jesus is not captive to the small-mindedness that the devil would have him give and take up as his own, right? We as human beings, rightfully so, not being, the Son of God ourselves, not being Jesus ourselves, we're often very tempted by small-minded things. I can think about, early days at Salem. I used to have this volunteer. He doesn't come anymore. But I used to have this volunteer that like a tread would fall off of a step, right? And he'd come up and he'd scream and he'd yell and he'd carry on, and I was thinking, well, geez, I haven't got my master degree. Why doesn't somebody just take a screwdriver and just, screw that thing back in there? Why are we wasting so much time screaming and yelling at one another about these steps, about these steps here? Like, why are we fighting and hating one another over something so small? Why are we doing that when we have a much larger thing happening here, being in this neighborhood where kids are wrestling with lead poisoning, right? People that, kids don't even have beds to sleep on, for Pete's sakes, Why then are you and I sitting down here as disciples of Jesus yelling at one another about material objects in a common space that we share? Why are we so angry about with one another about that? And in the midst of that, we're missing something larger. You know what I mean? We're missing the idea that God loves us, right? That God has still provided us somehow. Our churches, they shouldn't exist. I'm just going to say it flat out. None of these churches should exist. This is ridiculous that this exists. If you really think about it, right? This isn't a money maker. This isn't, Summit Street property, that's getting redeveloped, and with high rises going up and, new fandangled businesses that are going to make a ton of money off of lofts or off of, the idea that you're now important because you've bought a membership to an exclusive club that the mayor belongs to, selling importance to you. That's not what happens here. Instead, it's a place where people have this weird idea that they've experienced God's love and that they want to share that with other people, right? This is something beautiful. We've been given something beautiful. We get to know people that will yet believe in that yet feel that love in their hearts, or are supposed to feel that love in their hearts, that should feel that love in their hearts. And then that love trickles out. It's a beautiful thing that exists, that God cares for us and put us into relationship. I don't necessarily have to know Merlin Jacobs, but I think we'll all agree Merlin Jacobs is a really nice guy. He's a great guy. I don't have to know people from Bethel that'll help to take kids on the margins that experience a lot of suffering in their lives and give them a day at the opera, at the Valentine Theater. I don't have to know people that will raise up a large donation. Meanwhile, their congregations are really hurting in order to try to fix up the homes of people that are experiencing a lack of utilities that could be in homelessness, right? Those things are beautiful things that God has given to us, and that hints at the larger picture, right? That's the picture that Jesus sees. Jesus isn't interested in idle uses of our power, right? Jesus isn't interested in tiny things that don't make sense and that really aren't worth our time, but instead God is interested in this love which saves our lives and can save the lives of other people, not only in the hereafter, but also in this life when they feel like they're in the midst of a living death. And how many people in our world feel like they're in a living death, especially in this city where things are just so painful for so many people. And yet there's still people that God empowers and calls and gives wonderful gifts, I know to be a fact, that enact and that can feel and that can spread love in that. Something that may feel small, but which is actually the larger vision, right? We get tempted towards small-mindedness. And it's not surprising, we all have lots of moments of small-mindedness. But we're also a people that are captivated by God's bigness. And God shares that with us, even when we're maybe a little smaller than we'd like to be. God still gives us something that's so big, that love, that mission, that ability. And that's something that I think that we can thank God for as we go through this season of Lent and we enter into the bigger idea, which is love and life for all human beings, here and now and beyond, and expanding in ways that aren't always visible in pews, but are visible in the ways that we have helped people in this life, whether or not we've gotten anything back from it. And for all of this, we say, thanks be to God.